Okay, well, I am Suzanne Kay. I'm the current president of the Geological Society of America, and I would like to once again welcome you to the 125th anniversary meeting, where the registration is just topped over 8,000, making this the biggest meeting ever of the Geological Society of America. More specifically, I'm here today to welcome you to the 2013 Michael T. Halbouty Lecture, which will be given by Colorado Governor John W. Hickenlooper. As background, this lecture is named after Michael Halbouty, who in his 2004 New York Times obituary was called a legendary geologist, petroleum engineer, and wildcatter who discovered more than 50 oil fields. He was also a loyal member of GSA. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Vince Matthews, who will introduce the governor. Vince is the former director of the State Geological Survey of Colorado. He is now the interim director of the Mining Hall of Fame and Museum in Leadville, and most importantly, the local chair of the 125th anniversary meeting of Geological Society of America. Vince?
Well, what a pleasure and an honor to introduce my governor. I could tell you about the successes that he had as mayor of Denver, where he crossed party lines, city lines, county lines to form collaborative relationships up and down the Front Range and was overwhelmingly reelected. Or I could tell you about the challenges that he's had as governor with wildfires and floods that are still going on. But I want to tell you about, rather than his government service, his service to the geological sciences here in Denver. I first met him back, this image that they're going to bring up right now, is from 1986 Rocky Mountain Association of Geologists Directory. And he and I both lost our jobs in the petroleum industry about the same time there. And as a volunteer, and he's volunteered in many different organizations, he was the editor of the Mountain Geologist, and I was submitting a paper, and his editing helped me win the Best Paper Award the next year, so he's a great editor. But he decided, I went back into the petroleum industry, and he decided to follow a different path. He started Colorado's first brew pub. And I think we now have 165 specialty brewers in Colorado. And the 1980s were really tough times in Colorado. Lots of people had lost their jobs in the oil and gas industry, as the two of us had. And in the early 80s, the Rocky Mountain Association of Geologists could pull 200 to 400 people every Friday to a talk. And companies would pay the fee for the lunches. But by the 80s, the end of the 80s, things were really tough. And the Petroleum Club itself had gone out of existence. And the governor opened up the doors of his Wynkoop Brewery to many of these organizations to hold meetings. And I'm convinced that many of those societies would not have survived without that generosity. And even today, many small organizations still hold their meetings at that place. So places like the Rocky Mountain, or societies like the Rocky Mountain Association of Geologists, the Rocky Mountain section of SEPM, the Denver International Petroleum Society, and many others have held their meetings there. So on behalf of the geological community in Denver, I want to thank you for that, Governor, and it's a privilege to introduce you and have you welcome the governor of the great state of Colorado, John Hickenlooper.
Thank you, Vince. Very kind introduction, and there was a reason when we both got laid off in that same collapse of oil prices back in the mid-1980s, the reason why our paths diverged. You know, Robert Frost describing two paths, one less traveled. The difference was that Vince was actually a really good geologist. I have to be careful saying that because my thesis advisor and great mentor, Jim Gutman from Wesleyan University, as fine a petrologist and mineralogist as exists, is here. So to say that I'm not really up to snuff as a geologist might be taken the wrong way. Let me assure you that that had nothing to do with the faculty at Wesleyan University. I want to tell you that there must be some terrible mistake. This is the Michael T. Halbouty Distinguished Lecturer. Me? I mean, I can't even imagine the crisis. I heard that the GSA was coming to Colorado. It was the 125th, and I thought, this would be great. And, I'd be happy to speak. I thought I'd do an introduction. Usually when conventions come, sometimes if you have a connection to the industry that's coming, you do a slightly longer introduction. I remember, not when I was a student, when I came out and worked in the oil business in the early 80s, I knew exactly who Michael T. Halbouty was, right? Legendary wildcatter, had PhDs from a couple different universities. I mean, look at the people, just in recent history, who were the Michael T. Halbouty Distinguished Lecturers, right? Sally Benson, can sequestration of carbon dioxide in deep geological formations help solve the global warming problem? 2006, Rodney Ewing, the nuclear fuel cycle versus the carbon cycle. 2003, Ward Chesworth, bread from stones. And now me? I mean, I guarantee you those guys have more PhDs between them. They probably have multiple PhDs each. And for all of you, this is going to be like trying to get blood from a stone, I think. It is worth pointing out on the 125th anniversary, and I got laid off in the summer of 1986, and our whole company, I worked for Harper Oils, that little sign showed, and became Buckhorn Petroleum, became Midcon Corporation, got acquired in a bidding war between Occidental and Boone Pickens. So we had an anti-stock takeover thing where we got a year's pay vested over 10 years in a retirement fund, unless control of the company changed, in which case you got vested in everything. Well, not only did control of the company change, so we got vested in the whole year's salary, but the price of the stock more than doubled. So, I mean, we had secretaries, running down the hall with a $25,000 check after tax, screaming hysterically. You've never seen so many people so happy to lose their jobs in your entire life. And really, but I don't think any of us realized how difficult the industry was, how many people were on the streets. And, in the end, the only jobs that I could get were probably half the pay that I've been getting. And somehow in this process, I saw a brew pub in California, and with my friend Jerry Williams, who had been the geophysicist, and, we were an exploration team at Midcon. We started working on this brew pub. We finally, after 2 years, took forever to raise money because all our friends were out of work or, not getting any raises. So we finally, after 2 years, got this thing open on October 18th, 1988. 2 weeks later, maybe a week later, what happened? Or 2 weeks later. It was exactly 2 weeks later. The Geological Society of America had their 100th anniversary in Denver. In case you've forgotten, I will never forget. Because it took us so long to raise the money, we had no money for marketing. So we printed up these little cards that said, free beer, right? But as we were discussing this, before we got them printed, we decided we didn't have enough money to really give a free beer to everybody who came in. But we never changed it, so we forgot to take off the free beer off the top. But it says, come in, your first beer is only $1 if you come in and you have a business card from a geological connected field of any sort. And so we went outside the old convention center that stood kind of over there on this site, but over there, and we walked backwards at the end of every meals, the end of the day, for a couple of days, saying as quickly as we could, want to come to a brew pub started by 2 unemployed geologists? Or want to come to the first brew pub in the world started by 2 unemployed geologists? And for the next 7 years, that 7-day period was the all-time record we had in sales. Anyway, your question would be, how the heck did I end up in politics? And I think it's fair to say that you know, I'm going to guess 90% of you are thinking, how do I make sure this never happens to me, right? But I think, unlike many elected figures, I think transparency and the truth is always better up front. And I think I'll give you fair warning. I'll tell you a little story of how I ended up here. But part of my goal in telling this is to get more people from the earth sciences into public life. And even if you don't want to run for office, you know, people like Vince Matthews, who stepped up and even when he was working professionally in hydrocarbons, still was giving into the community, and then when he stepped down, was not so active in oil and gas exploration, became more involved in helping run the state Geological Society and making sure that we did a transition and moved it in with our Colorado School of Mines, one of the great geology schools in the world, second only to Wesleyan, Dr. Goodman. I knew that would get a lot of chuckles at this group. So I'm going to get, that's the kind of the arc of what I want to say. You know, I grew up outside Philadelphia. My mother was widowed twice, so we grew up in a family that was very flinty. My mother would wash tinfoil and saran wrap and reuse it. She'd tape it on the door of the refrigerator. You know, there was a whole process there of, you know, a process there of how you make your way in the world. And when I got to college, I really didn't know what I wanted to be. And as you can see from that picture, I had very thick glasses. When I got to college, I still had plenty of acne. I was even thinner then than I am now. And I did very well on my you know, college prep testing for math and science, but I was convinced I'd never ever have a girlfriend if I was going to study science. So I did everything but. I you know, took jazz piano, how to make stained glass windows, you know, go creative writing. It's interesting, and just an aside, so my undergraduate degree was in creative writing and English literature, and yet writing my master's thesis, and I wrote a master's thesis, this is just kind of foreshadowing what I'm going to say in the near future, but I wrote on a large Ignimbrite flow in the Absaroka Mountains in south central Montana, kind of in a Beartooth uplift. And you know, that process of writing a master's, and Jim Gutman, who's here, if any of you are having trouble with your writing, you should grab him, because he would use this incredibly small letters and write red pen, and we were on a dreadful deadline. So every night at about 1 o'clock in the morning, I'd slide whatever chapter I was writing under his door, because I was a night owl and worked right straight through, and then he would come in at 5 or 6 in the morning and go through it with a fine-tooth pen and get it back to clarity and simplicity. And that process, and trust me, when we wrote all the marketing materials for the brew pub, it's a strange way world treats these things. I ended up, you know, understanding how to communicate with people with clarity and concision, short. And we tried to do that even going from brew pub world to geology. Anyway, right, my last semester at Wesleyan as an undergraduate, I sat in on a class in land use planning taught by a guy named Skip Pezel with the U.S. Geological Survey, just a Wednesday night, 3 hours. And a friend was taking it. I sat in and loved it. I had like 6 pages of notes. I think they were talking about siting of septic systems or something. But it's so pragmatic and so practical. And so I found out that Wesleyan has a special program for people with non-science backgrounds that wanted to get a master's in earth and environmental science. So I kind of begged my way into it. I talked to Jim Gutman and another professor, Yella DeBoer, and they were skeptical at first. But they agreed to let me in as a special student on condition that I go out to the YBRA, Yellowstone Bighorn Research Association, so a field camp kind of run by Princeton, Amherst, Wesleyan professors up in Red Lodge, Montana. And I'd hitchhiked back and forth across the country a couple times. I'd been west, but I'd never been in the real west, right? And I'd never been to a place like Red Lodge, Montana, and then to go all across the state of Montana, seeing the most amazing geology that you could ever imagine, and I was hooked, right? And I came back to Wesleyan, and it took me, I had to take all the chemistry, physics. I hadn't taken a single science class as an undergraduate, if you can believe that, right? I'm a case study in what kids shouldn't do, right? At a certain point, I did all that. I had to take the undergraduate geology classes, and I had to take the master's stuff, and then I had to write the thesis. So it was literally another 4.5 years before I got my master's. At one point, Dr. Gutman and all the other professors in the geology department got together, and they gave me tenure as a student. I thought. Anyway, that experience of coming to geology late in life, and then coming out to Colorado to actually try and create a career in it, right? And there were no hard rock jobs in 1980 when I got my master's, and so I came out to Denver to work at an oil and gas company. Although, the great thing about a welded tuff, an Ignimbrite, which I had written my master's on, it functions like a classic depositional system, right? It's a fluid, it comes out, it's deposited in many of the same ways as sand, limestone, shales, the things that are valid to oil exploration. So I figured I may have been behind all the guys who'd come out from University of Oklahoma, who had studied nothing but sediments their whole lives. So I was trying to bring a fresh perspective into oil and gas. That's why, at least that's what I told my bosses. And I think the process, those 5 years of practicing as a geologist, has informed everything I've done the rest of my life. And part of that was having basic principles like the multiple working hypotheses, that if you're trying to solve a problem, don't come up with experiments or data for just one possible solution. Always go for 3 or 4 possible solutions, right? Try and design your experiments to get as much information and don't box yourself in to one outcome. If you squint your eyes and look at the challenges we have in public policy and government now, a huge part of the problem is the fact that we have people designing their experiments thinking they already know what the solution is. And you end up having unintended consequences with, ridiculous costs that in many cases could have been avoided if there'd been a broader, more open process of gathering information around the problem you're trying to solve. And I include, what for years people did around homelessness. This is when I first got elected mayor. The process of homelessness, people just threw money at it. They never sat down and said, all right, what are the components of people that find themselves homeless and chronically homeless? Okay, and if you've got those components, how do we address them and measure how much money we're spending for each component and where are we getting the greatest reward? And that's essentially when I got elected mayor in 2003, which wasn't supposed to happen, just so we were guaranteed that as long, and I was, I've never run a negative ad. It was always going to be positive this, positive that. There's no way I could ever win. But we won, and we wanted to tackle something that no one had ever really had made progress with. And homelessness was perfect because we went out and measured the living daylights out of it for about 18 months. And people with mental health, a lot of military vets come back with post-traumatic stress syndrome. We saw a great many people who had been contributing members of society, but they were emotionally fragile, and something terrible happened in their lives. A loved one died, or they had an accident, and suddenly they couldn't keep it together, and they slipped into homelessness. If they'd had a little bit of support at the right time, they would have been fine. And so we looked at each of those components and what were the best ways to treat them, each of those components, and we raised money from the public sector. We demonstrated the benefits that would come to the hotel industry if we got more of the panhandlers off the 16th Street Mall, the benefits that would come to a number of different industry sectors, and got money from them and used that as experiments, a variety of experiments to try and see which approaches work best. And we cut, in 6 years, we cut the chronic homeless population in Denver by 75%. Again, strictly geological principles. And I think there's a benefit, well, maybe not strictly geological principles. There's a benefit to looking at things from data, just the basic point of view of data. And I got into this fight with my son Teddy, I'm a late bloomer in a variety of ways, and he's 11. Last spring he was 10, and we got into this argument over, he was complaining about how much homework, and it took a turn for the worse. And he looked at me and goes, "Daddy, what do you do that's so hard every day at work? Make decisions?" I said, "Well, Teddy, it's not so." He goes, "Daddy, get the facts, make a decision, check, next." I said, "Well, Teddy," he said, No, Daddy, get the facts, make a decision, check, next. Every day I've got to come into school and learn something completely new that I didn't know existed the day before. If I don't get it completely right, my next day is misery, because everything's based on the day before." Then, 15 minutes later, I gave in. I said, "You're right. 5th grade is harder than being governor." Oops. And so, of course, the next day, I realized what I should have said. This has been the story of my life. The next day, I knew what I should have said, and that was that we don't all have the same facts anymore, right? And the biggest challenge to making good decisions is making sure we have the same facts. And part of that is 50 years or 30 years ago, we had the Encyclopedia Britannica, we had, Walter Cronkite. We kind of had a shared set of reputable places to get information. Now that's all fractured and dislocated, and too much. The sheer the sheer stress on our information system has had tremendously negative consequences. And I think one thing that the geologists bring to public policy is being able to use analogy. And actually, I was just talking to Jim Gutman, and he allowed me to, the Sigma Psi competitions where you have scientists from all different disciplines who judge graduate students on a presentation, something to do with their thesis. So my thesis was on this Ignimbrites, volcanic rocks. So I wanted to demonstrate exactly how vesiculation worked, right? Those little bubbles that once they form, as the magma comes up, the lower pressure allows those bubbles to form, and then they take up so much volume, they push the fluid higher up, there's less pressure, they grow faster, all of a sudden you have a volcanic eruption, right? Well, what better way to demonstrate that than to shake up a bottle of beer, right? And this is long before I ever thought I'd be in the beer business. A couple shakes, pop it. Of course, I sprayed some of the top biologists, chemists. It was everywhere. Although I did win, just so we're clear. And I think that those kinds of analogies carry over right now. We're in Colorado, we are a purple state, strong environmental community, but also huge extractive industry around, especially hydrocarbons. And the issues surrounding directional drilling and hydraulic fracturing are right at the surface. Whatever you see in other parts of the country, they're everywhere. And I use the analogy. We just talked about vesiculation in beer. Again, this is another case. I joke to people all the time when I went from a laid-off geologist. You think about it, almost all the oil that we produce has some level of dissolved gas under pressure held in a liquid form, exactly like beer, right? And when I got into the brew pub business, I told people, we sold our beer for, $2.50 a pint, $5 for a quart, $20 in a gallon, 31, $600 a gallon for our beer. If the price of oil had been 1/10 of that, I would have still been a geologist. But it's always been, somehow in my life, always these key things are always fluid under pressure, right? Whether magma, beer, and now frac fluid. Because if you actually look at this revolution really a revolution in technology, it's not like discovering a giant. These innovations, and just for some of you that rebel at federal funding for wind energy or solar energy or other forms of energy, know that the federal government spent many billions of dollars in the research connected with in the late 1990s or late 1980s and 1990s with these technology breakthroughs. And frac fluid, I just, the moment I ever heard, I really understood when we were doing fracking when I was a geologist in 1981. First well I ever sat, we did a frac. And the notion that you could push fluid under tremendous pressure into a rock formation that's a mile, 2 miles underground and put enough pressure on to get the little bits of silt into the microfractures, and they would hold open the formation and allow you to dramatically increase your production. I love the way that felt existentially. It must have been that my fetish for fluids under pressure. What's happened now is we've gotten into a huge battle over the social issues surrounding it, right? And because directional drilling and fracking are have so dramatically revolutionized where we can find hydrocarbons and where we can produce them cost effectively, we end up with people. It's really a land use issue. People don't want it close to their suburban community, but they make it into an environmental issue. And what we've been trying to do in Colorado is to really focus on separating those two arguments and saying, all right, if this is an environmental issue, if it's about water quality, air quality, the quality of our landscape, let's address that. And so there was a lot of, 3 years ago, a real hysteria about the composition of frac fluids. And we had a voluntary program here where 90% of the companies revealed, the ingredients, or at least 90% of the ingredients in the frac fluids they were using. And yet the media was still whipping up hysteria against all fracking, but especially around, what are they hiding? What's that 10% hiding? And so I'd been on the board of the Art Museum, and through one of the other directors there, got to meet, or I was complaining, I said, I need to get somebody from the industry, and especially the services industry, to talk about, we're losing the battle here, and I'm not sure what we're protecting is worth the losses we're sustaining. And literally 4 days later, Dave Lazar, who is the chairman CEO of Halbouty, was in my office, and we were talking about fracking and about public relations and about the importance of making sure that people get the facts, right? That, just like Teddy, and that the lack of information, the lack of facts, really does push this kind of this hysteria that was going on. And one of his staff, I'd heard that he had a frac fluid they were working on that was all food additives, a prototype. They couldn't make it commercially yet, or at least cost effectively, but every additive, every part of the frac fluid had been signed off on by the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. And so I heard that he actually had drunk in this. I mentioned to one of the people, and they said, oh yeah, it's totally drinkable. And he pulls some out. And that was the moment where, here's a smart guy. He's wary. He's cautious. It's the first time he's ever met me. No level of trust. And I said, so you've drunk this? And he goes, yeah. So I took it, and I took a swig. And it didn't go down great, right? I mean, it was really like drinking flavorless Jell-O that hadn't set, right? Very viscous. And, he was, he laughed. But, from that moment, he leaned in, right? And we had a level of trust. And it took 6.5 months, but 6.5 months later, we had a press conference with the Environmental Defense Fund, their leadership, and the leadership, Senior Vice President of Operations for Halliburton, in my office, and we worked out a frac fluid disclosure regulation that both sides claimed victory. I mean, I think that's where we've got to get back to in public policy, is the ability to take some of the disturbance and the friction out of public policy. When I first got elected mayor, I used, and again, you have to understand, no one thought I'd get elected mayor, right? So, I mean, the first time when we'd gone for 3% in the polls, and the poll came out, and suddenly I'd gone to 33%. I'd done a funny ad, and my wife looked over, she had the newspaper, she's reading the poll, and she looks over it, so just her eyes are peering out of the top of the newspaper, and she looks at me and she says, you never told me you were gonna win, right? And so, as a new mayor, and Denver's a strong mayor city, so I had a great deal of influence, and I started talking publicly using geological metaphors and analogies, just like I have been here. And one that I loved was the use of Bernoulli's equation. And Bernoulli's principle that states, and is written down here, for an inviscid flow, an increase in the speed of fluid occurs simultaneously with a decrease in pressure or a decrease in the fluid's potential energy. I never said that. I don't even know what envisaged means, although the genius, Max Potter, who's here somewhere, who actually helps write these speeches, he pointed out it's a fluid with no friction, right? So that it's laminar flow, I got that. Fluid through a pipe that has no friction. That would be an inviscid fluid. Anyway, if you take Bernoulli's principle and you apply it to Bernoulli's equation, which I almost failed hydrology because of Bernoulli's equation, it does take a basic principle that is, for a given diameter of pipe and a given viscosity of fluid, it takes a certain amount of work, and Bernoulli's equation defines how much work it takes to push that amount of fluid through the pipe. The more viscous it is, the more work, the more energy you need. The smaller the pipe, the more work you need, because there's, again, more friction per volume. What was amazing to me was there's also something called the roughness coefficient. And so for every pit or dimple that you have on the inside of that pipe, you create turbulence, right? Little eddies, and each bit of turbulence increases the amount of work, the amount of energy it takes to push the same amount of fluid through a given pipe. Well, that is a direct analogy to trying to get public policy done, right? I know, it's not immediately apparent. The rest of you are too polite to laugh. But I think that the bottom line is that we don't, when you have an issue you're trying to work with, whether it's homelessness or whether you're trying to deal with, the pros and cons and the environmental impacts of hydrologic fracturing and directional drilling, my sense is that for any given policy that you want to get through, it's going to take a certain amount of work. And the more turbulence you have, and that's people on the sidelines, oftentimes not speaking facts, they're oftentimes not operating in good faith, and these could be on both sides of any given issue. That turbulence means you're going to have to spend a lot more work. And just like with the fluid dynamics around a pipe, of fluid through a pipe, we try to go as quickly as we can and smooth over those pits and dimples and get and minimize as much as possible that turbulence. So when we hear people saying distortions about an issue, we try to get them into the office, or I try and go directly to visit them to put that at rest. And we do it in a public way as much as possible, because I think, there are a number of different agendas out there, there are a number of different places, and people aren't always operating in good faith, but many times they are, and they just have the wrong information. If you ask me two big problems with politics in America right now, and just turn on your TV set and look at Washington, I mean, almost nobody does that anymore, right? I have an argument. Well, these are two things. One is that the partisanship and negative advertising that we see all the time in our politics is having a hugely destructive, more than we imagine, on our democratic process. And the analogy I use is if you had Coke and Pepsi, and Coke did an attack ad against Pepsi, these work. Without question, an attack ad, Pepsi's sales would go down. The reason Coke doesn't do that is because Pepsi would do a counterattack, and they do a negative ad against Coke, and Coke sales would go down, so Coke would have to attack Pepsi, Pepsi would attack Coke. What happens is you diminish the entire sales in that product category of soft drinks. What we're doing is we're diminishing the product category of democracy, and people stop watching the news on TV, and they stop reading the newspaper or getting their information wherever they get it now, and they just turn off. The other thing is that tied in with that, our elected officials, most of them haven't been in business. And they haven't been in a field like geology or a place where facts matter, right? And you can argue over opinions, but you try not to argue about facts. You try to negotiate and compromise to both sides can use the same set of facts. Elected officials love to put the other person down. They think it raises themselves up. It's the stupidest thing in the world, right? 3 weeks into running the restaurant, the Wine Coop Brewing Company, I knew that there's no margin in having enemies. No matter how unreasonable the customer is, I'll kill. Well, I won't kill. I'll move heaven and earth to make sure they know I care about the relationship, and that going forward we want to continue that relationship. And that's, any small business knows that, and yet elected officials seem to take a strange delight in attacking each other more vehemently, and at a certain point, that's going to take a toll, that people aren't going to be able to respond. There's a book, and I meant to bring a copy over here with me, called Leadocracy. And there's a guy named Jeff Smart, G-E-O-F, Jeff Smart, and he wrote a book called Who? Best book for senior executives in big corporations, the best book on how to hire senior staff that I've ever read. It should be used everywhere. And he came and helped us during our transition when I got elected governor to hire really talented people. And he was amazed that we had so few A-list candidates for these cabinet positions. And I said, well, people think elected office and government is dirty. They think it's partisan, they think it's wasteful, they think the public eye is going to come on you. And all these things I could say, generally they may be true in the reality of a narrow interest. But to the large scale, I mean, this is the greatest job I've ever had, and I've had a bunch of different jobs. I think I've met the most incredible people, and we've done the most incredible things. We've taken on immense challenges. I mean, it's the most joyful work, the most rewarding thing I've ever done, and yet most people won't even consider it. So he wrote this book called Leadocracy, which is basically the idea is a democracy of leaders, and that a leadocracy, I mean, right now, 84% of the people that have MBAs, management degrees, are in private sector business, and yet 60% of the jobs are in nonprofits or government, right? So we don't have the same leadership there. And the way to get it is to get more people from private sector jobs, more people with technical backgrounds. Do you realize we could only find one other geologist in the history of the United States who's ever been a governor, right? I mean, it boggles the mind, right? That the people that are most fact-based understand the principles of discovery, understand the principles of change, right? How entities change, that we're locking ourselves out of public service. And let me tell you, that is so joyful. And again, I'm not saying the pay is great. The governor of Colorado gets paid $90 grand, right? But it is more than compensated by the quality of life and the benefits you accrue in all these other ways. So, you should get the book Leadocracy. We now have a group of 12 CEOs that come in every 3 months, and they spend 2 hours in my office, and we talk to them. We bring in my cabinet members, talk to about what the challenges are, what my cabinet people love about it. Every one of them. Our head of technology here was senior vice president of global IT services for Oracle, second largest software company in the world. She loves working for government. Now she's going to go back and make a bunch of money, right? She's 43 years old. She wanted to give a few years to public service and kind of reinvent herself, and this was a great way for her. That's a great opportunity for everybody. And I think if we can get enough people, such as yourselves, or maybe not you, but a friend of yours, and it's, the idea with these 12 people is that they will, sometime before they're 70, give 2 years to public service, right? Either running a nonprofit, not just sitting on a board, but running a nonprofit, or serving in a cabinet, or running for mayor or governor. But spend a couple years really giving back into public service. And I can tell you, I know almost no one who's done this who's disappointed. People say it's impossible to change government, that this bitterness and this partisanship, which no geologist, well, actually I've seen some pretty bitter partisan geologists, but it's not about Republicans and Democrats, it's about, different scientific principles. But no rational people would operate the way our elected officials operate, and the more people we can get from the world, such as yourselves, we can change it. And I always told this story when I was running for mayor, and we were at 2% in the polls, I had to keep the people motivated that you could do something that seemed impossible. And I had this story from the Denver Post. It was 2 inches of just a little column about a professor of public speaking at the University of Wyoming. And she was talking about the importance of using opposites. If you talk about the worst of times, you talk about the best of times. If you talk about the agony, you talk about the ecstasy. She asked her class, what's the opposite of despair? The kid raises his hand and goes, joy? She goes, exactly. You want people to feel despair. Use joy in the same sentence. The words gain emotional impact by being together. Then she said, what's the opposite of woe? And the kid way in the back goes, giddy up, right? And ladies and gentlemen, that is the opposite of woe, right? When you think we can't change government, we are the original experiment in democracy. If we can't change it, no one can, right? It's our government, and we got to just giddy up, right? The opposite of woe is to giddy up. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I've always known geologists are the nicest of people. I've known that ever since I first got into the field, because I know damn well I wasn't that good. But I appreciate it. I've got time for a couple of questions. I spoke a little too long, and I apologize. No questions? Come on. You can ask me anything. Yes? Well, I run with Elizabeth Warren on my ticket. I'm ready. Let's go. Take Washington. I don't know. I'm not sure what I did wrong to you that you would even try to send me to Washington. What penalty? I said we should give time to public service. I didn't say we should all go to Washington. That's a different thing. But I appreciate it. That's a nice compliment. Yeah.
It seems from Boulder, point of view of Boulder, that the opposition to high fracking is almost a level of theological dispute. So we congratulate your effort to bring facts to this. How do you answer the people who are concerned about the environmental issues associated with fracking?
So the question was, how do we answer the people, I mean, in Boulder County, and it is almost a theological issue for many environmentalists. They are categorically opposed to anything to do with fracking. And you know, the bottom line is there's a part of almost any social issue, right, where there's two sides. There's a part on the fringe of both positions that generally is unreasonable. Not always, but generally. And at a certain point, we try to listen to everyone. We try to have open meetings. But when I get in with somebody who's really being unreasonable about any issue, I use some of the rules, some of the tricks that we used in the restaurant business when someone was really upset with you, right? And the person, one of the real keys that works every day is to listen closely. If you want to change someone's mind, try listening, right? And then ask them to say it again, and then say it again, and say it in a different way. And people, you repeat back what they're saying. You know, in the restaurant business, this is good because it's, you know, they say, you say to them, oh, so the server didn't look where he was going. Oh, and he actually threw the bowl of soup under your lap. And yes, the soup was very hot. I hear that. People hear their own words back to them, and it calms them down. It's a fact. You learn this in the restaurant business. But listening, so often people's biggest issue is something different than what you think it is. And this is even true at the extreme edges, the margins. In fracking, where you've got people that are just absolutely against fracking. You know, some of them just you can't move. But some of them, if you spend the time and listen to them hard enough, they'll be talking about something that is different and that you can address. The people that won't listen, I mean, no matter how hard you listen, they're not going to change, and they're not using facts. At a certain point, you give up, and you cannot waste your entire day with one person or two people if they're not going to deal with facts. And so, you know, but that's generally a fairly small number of people. When I'm in Boulder, I went up and did a town hall meeting on fracking, and Boulder, for those of you from out of town, is the center of the debate in the West, I think, or certainly in this state, of the risks of hydraulic fracturing. And I gave the basic, you know, some of the facts that we don't use enough, you know, that inexpensive natural gas, if you look at the entire United States, it's the equivalent of putting, in those areas where they use natural gas as a fuel for electrical generation and for even transportation for heating, it's the same as putting $1,200 per family into the household budget. That's real money. For working people, that's tax-free, right? That's money that they don't have to spend, so they don't have to earn the $1,500 to pay taxes and end up with $1,200. We never talk about that. We don't talk about how much cleaner our air is as we convert coal plants. Coal plants are twice as dirty as natural gas electrical plants, and the reduction in particulates and sulfur dioxide, and you don't have any mercury attached to that sulfur dioxide. Those benefits are dramatic. We're halfway to compliance with Kyoto. We should talk about that more often. We never signed Kyoto, but the United States has reduced our carbon emissions per capita. It's not all natural gas, but it's 60, 70, 80% of its increased use of inexpensive natural gas. That drop, I mean, we've cut our per capita carbon emissions to the place they were back in 1960, right? When Kennedy became president, 1961. And we have reduced our carbon per capita emissions more than all the other signatories to the Kyoto Protocol combined, right? We don't talk about that. And that's the kind of stuff, if you've got environmental people that really care about the environment, but also are open to facts and listening, you have a long enough discussion. You may not win them over, but you can understand why we're working so hard in Colorado to create a regulatory environment that is strict, highest standards. And again, the larger oil companies are great with this. Some of the smaller companies they're against any regulations. And I keep trying to tell them, you take that on at your own risk, because sooner or later, we have 4 towns. One town has already banned fracking in their whole town limits, and they've got some serious oil and gas on the periphery of their town. That's a taking, right? In our state constitution, it protects people's rights to get there, if they own the mineral rights, to get it out. So we had to sue them. It's the worst thing you can do as a governor, right? But when you go up and sit down and talk to them and let them know that, my gosh, inexpensive natural gas is a real reason for it, they suddenly are willing to work harder to try and find compromises about frac disclosure, about making sure that we don't have escaped methane, some of the issues that are legitimate concerns we should all be concerned about, all right? And in many of these cases, I think the oil and gas industry is willing to sit down side by side with the environmental community and let's work it out. I mean, that's the way it should happen. And even in Boulder, again, there's this very narrow group of people that won't listen, but most people are open and saying, yeah, I didn't know that. Let's continue the discussion.
Thank you, Governor.
You bet, thank you. The one thing I forgot to mention, so they asked me about what happened to my hip, because I did have major hip surgery 8 weeks ago now. As my communications director pointed out, if you put your foot in your mouth as often as I do, what do you expect? Anyway, thank you all.